Frank Delaney, a veteran with PTSD, faces disrespect at the Red Elk Lodge when clerk Ryan insists on a pet fee for his service dog, Shadow, despite federal law. As tension builds, Frank's calm resolve and Shadow's steady presence expose Ryan's ignorance. A mysterious guest call to corporate shifts the tide, forcing Ryan to retract the fee and apologize. The incident sparks a broader policy change, but the real story lies in what's left unresolved. How many others face this daily? Will Ryan's lesson endure? Discover the ripple effect of one man's quiet fight for dignity. If Frank's story moved you, join the conversation. Share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. Like, subscribe, and support our channel to amplify powerful stories of veterans and invisible disabilities. Let's honor their sacrifices by listening and learning together. Thank you for watching. The snow fell in delicate, whispering flurries, blanketing the gravel lot of the Red Elk Lodge in Missoula, Montana, with a quiet that felt almost sacred. The cold was sharp, slicing through the night with a precision that seemed to seek out every exposed inch of skin, settling deep into the bones of anyone foolish enough to linger. Frank Delaney, however, welcomed the bite of it. At 68, he'd faced far worse than a Montana winter's edge. Sweltering deserts in Kandahar, suffocating jungles in Panama, nights where the air itself seemed to choke the life out of you. The cold, by contrast, was honest. It didn't pretend to be anything it wasn't, and it had a way of hushing the world, muting the chaos that sometimes roared too loudly in his mind. Tonight, that silence was a gift. The Red Elk Lodge stood like a sentinel from a bygone era, its hand-carved wooden beams framing the entrance with a rugged dignity. Behind frosted lobby windows, yellowed photographs of frontier soldiers gazed out, their faces stern and faded, as if guarding the stories of those who'd passed through. Inside, the glow of a single desk lamp cast a warm, amber pool across the reception counter, pushing back the shadows of the dimly lit room. Frank stepped inside, his boots softly crunching the salt scattered on the mat, and at his side moved Shadow, a sleek black Labrador whose steps were as deliberate and synchronized as a soldier's. Shadow's eyes, alert and calm, scanned the quiet lobby with the instincts of a creature trained to notice what others missed. He was more than a companion. He was Frank's anchor, his quiet strength in a world that often felt unsteady. Frank carried the weight of his years in the slight curve of his back, a remnant of parachute jumps and decades of missions that had demanded he bear more than just physical loads. His silver hair, barely visible beneath a worn navy ball cap, caught the faint light as he approached the desk. A faded flannel shirt clung to his lean frame beneath his jacket, and in his hand he held a soft leather folder, its edges curled and softened by time, like an old friend who'd seen too much but never complained. Inside that folder were papers he'd learned to carry everywhere: service records, Shadow's registration, VA medical documentation, proof of things he shouldn't have to prove anymore. Not after everything he'd given. Each document was a quiet testament to a life of duty, a life that had left scars both visible and unseen. Behind the desk sat Ryan, a young man no older than 24, his fingers tapping idly at a keyboard as if the act itself could ward off the boredom of a late-night shift. His name tag gleamed under the lamp, the word Ryan etched in crisp black letters. His smile when he offered it was mechanical, the kind you flash to fill the silence rather than to mean anything by it. "Evening, sir, checking in?" he asked, his eyes still fixed on the screen, barely registering the man before him. "Delaney, Frank Delaney," Frank replied, his voice steady but warm, carrying the faintest trace of a southern drawl that had softened over years spent far from home. Shadow sat beside him, posture ramrod straight, his vest clearly marked with the words, "Service animal, do not pet." The dog's presence was a quiet command, a reminder of purpose and discipline that needed no words. Ryan typed a few keys, the clack of the keyboard unnaturally loud in the stillness, and retrieved a single room key from a drawer. "Room 106, one queen. Staying one night?" he asked, finally glancing up. Frank nodded, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "I'm in town for a funeral. Marine. Old friend." The words came out simply, but they carried a weight Ryan couldn't possibly understand. A brotherhood forged in fire, a loss that cut deeper than the cold outside. Frank's mind flickered to the man he'd come to honor, a brother in arms whose laughter had once filled the silence of long nights, whose absence now left a void no words could fill. Ryan gave a non-committal grunt, the kind that said he'd heard worse and didn't care to linger on it. "Sorry to hear that," he said, pushing a clipboard across the counter. "Standard policy form. Sign there and we'll get you set." His tone was practiced, detached, as if he'd recited the line 1,000 times before. Frank reached for the pen, his calloused fingers brushing the cool metal. But Ryan's eyes suddenly locked onto Shadow, and his smile faltered. Pets aren't allowed in rooms," he said, his voice tightening as his frown deepened. "You'll need to pay a cleaning fee." Frank's hand paused, hovering above the clipboard. He glanced down at Shadow, who sat motionless, his dark eyes fixed on some distant point, as if he understood the absurdity of the moment but chose to rise above it. The vest on Shadow's back was unmistakable, its bold lettering a silent declaration of his role. "He's not a pet," Frank said, his voice calm but firm, like a man who'd explained this too many times before. "He's a medical service dog, fully trained, covered by the 8 Almetum." Ryan's skepticism was palpable, his lips twisting into a half-smirk that suggested he'd heard this excuse before. "Sure, but the owner's real picky about animal dander in the rooms. It's an old building, you know, the carpets hold smells. We charge all guests with dogs." His tone was dismissive, as if Frank's words were just noise, as if the vest and the dog's quiet discipline meant nothing. Frank's jaw tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. Instead, he slid the leather folder across the counter with a gentleness that belied the storm brewing inside him. "Everything's here," he said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet resolve. "Documentation, registration, medical necessity. Federal law doesn't allow you to charge for a service dog." Ryan barely glanced at the folder, his eyes flicking over it with the disinterest of someone who'd already made up his mind. "Yeah, we get all kinds with papers like this," he said, his voice now cold, stripped of the false warmth he had offered earlier. "I'm just doing my job." He tapped the keyboard again, and a $108 pet sanitation fee appeared on the screen, glowing like an insult. Frank stared at the charge, his blue eyes unblinking, the lines on his face deepening as he processed the moment. His hand tightened around the folder, not in anger but in a kind of weary indecision, as if he were weighing whether to fight a battle he'd fought too many times before. Shadow leaned closer, his warmth pressing against Frank's leg, a subtle reminder that he wasn't alone. The dog didn't growl or shift. He didn't need to. His presence was enough, a steadying force that kept Frank grounded when the world felt like it was tilting. Inside, Frank's mind churned. He wasn't angry, not yet. Anger was a luxury he'd learned to set aside long ago, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that came from having to prove himself over and over. He'd faced enemy fire, carried wounded men through hell, and buried friends who'd never made it home. He'd earned his scars, his limp, his nightmares. And Shadow, who woke him from those nightmares, who guided him through crowds when the noise grew too loud, who gave him a reason to keep going. And now, in this quiet lobby, he was being asked to prove it all again, to a kid who didn't even care to look at the papers in front of him. The injustice of it burned, not as a raging fire, but as a slow, smoldering ember that threatened to flare if pushed too far. Ryan, oblivious to the weight of the moment, tapped his fingers on the counter, his smirk still lingering, as if he'd won some small victory. He didn't see the man before him, not the veteran, not the survivor, not the soul carrying a lifetime of sacrifice. To Ryan, Frank was just another guest, another problem to be processed and dismissed. The check-in had turned into something else, a quiet clash of worlds, one shaped by duty and loss, the other by indifference and routine. Then the phone rang, its shrill tone slicing through the tension like a blade. Ryan sighed as if the interruption were a personal affront and picked up the receiver. "Red Elk Lodge, how can I help you?" Batush said, his voice reverting to its practiced politeness. Frank stood still, his hand still gripping the folder, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the counter. Shadow remained at his side, ever vigilant, ever loyal. In the next 7 minutes, the world would shift. The voice on the other end of that call would unravel Ryan's smirk, shut down the hotel, and rewrite company policy in ways no one could have predicted. But in that moment, as the snow continued to fall outside, Frank Delaney stood quietly, a man who'd faced far worse than a clerk's indifference, waiting for the world to catch up to the truth he'd carried all along. The snow fell thick and silent outside the Missoula Lodge, cloaking the world in a hush that felt both serene and stifling. Inside, a colder tension was taking root, woven from misunderstanding and indifference. Frank stood at the check-in counter, his broad frame steady, but his heart heavy with exhaustion. He was no stranger to battles, on distant battlefields and in the quiet corners of his own mind, but this one carried a familiar sting. He was tired, not just from the long drive or the weight of his duffel, but from the endless need to explain scars no one could see. Shadow, his service dog, sat still at his side, his dark eyes radiating a quiet wisdom. Frank didn't need to glance down to feel Shadow's presence. The dog was an anchor, steadying him against a storm he'd long stopped trying to escape. Across the counter, Ryan the clerk typed with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Each keystroke rang out in the sterile lobby, a hollow sound that seemed to mock Frank's resolve. With a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, Ryan angled the monitor so Frank could see the screen. Additional fee, $180. Animal sanitation, non-refundable. The smugness in Ryan's stance was palpable, as if he'd just won a game Frank hadn't chosen to play. To Ryan, this was just policy, a rule to enforce. To Frank, it was a reminder that the world often overlooked wounds that didn't bleed. Frank drew a slow breath, not a sigh, but a deliberate act to calm the rising pressure in his chest. His fingers moved with the precision of a soldier handling classified documents, lifting a leather folder that had become his shield in moments like this. Inside were papers that had traveled with him through airports, courtrooms, and now this remote lodge. Documents that spoke of sacrifice, survival, and a diagnosis too often questioned. He slid them across the counter with quiet authority, a man who'd faced greater foes than a skeptical clerk. "Here's my VA medical authorization," he said, his voice steady as a deep river. "That letter outlines my diagnosis. Here's Shadow's official ID, and here's the federal code protecting service animals from extra charges under 80 law." Ryan barely glanced at the top sheet before leaning back, arms crossed in dismissal. "Yeah," he said, his tone laced with skepticism. "I've seen this kind of thing before. Anyone can print stuff like that off the internet." The words struck Frank like a jab, sharp and intentional. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching as he fought to stay composed. Inside, a familiar vice gripped his chest, a tremor threatening his left hand. He'd stood in this place before, facing someone who couldn't see the nightmares that woke him or the panic that could grip him unbidden. "Are you saying this is fake?" Frank asked, his voice low but sharp. "I'm saying I don't know what's real anymore," Ryan replied, shrugging as if Frank's life was just another annoyance. "Last week I had a lady with a chihuahua in a stroller claiming it was her emotional support animal. She had paperwork too." Frank's eyes narrowed, but his voice held firm. "That wasn't a service dog," he said. "Shadow was trained by veterans for recovery over 18 months of certification. He performed specific tasks: nightmare interruption, panic intervention, mobility assistance. He's not a pet." Shadow didn't stir, but his dark eyes fixed on Ryan, calm yet piercing, as if he understood the weight of the moment. His stillness spoke of training and a bond forged in darkness Ryan couldn't fathom. The lobby grew quiet, the tension at the counter spreading like ripples in water. Near the vending machine, an older couple in their 70s stood still, watching. The woman clutched a coffee cup, her knuckles pale, her brow creased with empathy or recognition. Her husband stood behind her, protective, a faded veteran's cap on his head, its insignia too worn to read. The way he looked at Shadow suggested he knew more than he said. To the right, a young man, barely 20, lingered behind a pillar, a name tag visible under his flannel. "Toby, intern." He said nothing, but his eyes flicked between Frank and Ryan, absorbing every word. Ryan shifted, unnerved by the growing audience. His bravado wavered, but only slightly. "Look, sir," he said, softer but still defensive. "I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm just following my manager's rules. Animals require sanitation fees. I didn't make them." Frank's gaze didn't falter. No, he said, but you're enforcing them incorrectly. You don't get to override federal law with hotel policy. Ryan scoffed, the sound barely audible but cutting. Well, he muttered, looking away, you don't look disabled to me. The words hit like a slap, raw and cruel. Frank didn't flinch, but something shifted inside. A flare of anger, a deep sadness. He'd heard this before from those who thought disability was always visible. Shadow sensed it, behind that, moving closer, his side pressing against Frank's leg. A small, purposeful motion. Shadow was trained to feel the quickening breath, the tremor, the tightening chest. He was a lifeline, grounding Frank in a moment that threatened to overwhelm. Do you know what this is? Frank asked, his voice a steady whisper, each word deliberate. It doesn't always come with a cane or mask. Ryan's gaze dropped, but he offered no apology. I'm not a doctor, he mumbled. It's easier to charge everyone the same. Frank shook his head. No, he said. It's easier to discriminate and hope people stay quiet. The couple by the vending machine nodded silently, the man's eyes meeting Frank's with understanding. Ryan stared at the screen, the 180 fee a challenge. Frank stood resolute, a survivor ready to face another fight, armed with the strength he'd earned through years of battles unseen. Frank sat in the sterile glow of the hotel lobby, his eyes locked on the computer screen, where the 180 charge glared back at him, cold and unyielding, like a verdict carved in stone. The weight of it wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the way the charge seemed to mock him, a silent accusation that his life, his struggles, his very presence here with Shadow by his side, amounted to nothing more than a line item on a bill. Frustration churned in his gut, but it was morphing now, curling into something deeper, more sinister. A heavy, suffocating resentment that pressed against his ribs. It wasn't just the fee, it was the way Ryan, the young clerk behind the polished marble desk, had spoken to him, his voice clipped, his eyes dismissive. The way he glanced at Shadow, not with curiosity or respect, but with a faint sneer, as if the dog were nothing more than a nuisance, a smudge of dirt tracked in from the street. To Ryan, Shadow was just a pet on a leash. He couldn't see what Frank knew in his bones, that Shadow was a lifeline, a steady anchor through nights so dark most people couldn't fathom them even in their worst nightmares. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, a high-pitched drone that burrowed into Frank's skull. To anyone else, it was just background noise, unremarkable. But to Frank, it was a trigger, a subtle blade slicing through the thin veneer of calm he'd been clinging to. The air in the lobby felt stale, thick with the artificial scent of carpet cleaner and the faint chemical tang of furniture polish. It clung to his throat, making each breath feel heavier than the last. The walls didn't move, but they seemed to inch closer, their smooth, cream-colored surfaces pressing in like the confines of a trap. The ceiling didn't lower, but the air above him grew denser, as if gravity itself had doubled. His shoulders sagged under the invisible weight, like sandbags stacked one by one across his back. He knew this feeling too well. It always started like this. His mind slipped, unbidden, to Beirut, 1983. The acrid stench of concrete dust and diesel fuel flooded his senses, as vivid now as it had been then. He could almost taste the choking black smoke that had billowed from the collapsed barracks, could hear the screams of men, boys really, younger than Ryan, dragging each other from the rubble, their voices raw with desperation, calling for medics who would never arrive in time. Blood had soaked into the stone steps, pooling in cracks, staining the ground in a way that no amount of rain could ever wash clean. Then Iraq, years later. The relentless heat wasn't here in this air-conditioned lobby, but Frank felt it anyway. A dry, merciless force that scorched the back of his throat and made every breath a struggle. He'd driven through Fallujah, past markets that seemed ordinary until they exploded into chaos. He'd seen children, boys no older than his grandson, strapped with wired vests, their eyes hollow, used as pawns in a game of destruction. A wrong glance, a wrong step, and it was over. That was all it took. In Panama, the night missions through jungles where rain-slicked leaves glistened under moonlight, where mud sucked at his boots, slowing every move, making every moment a gamble. The air there had reeked of rot and fear, a smell that lingered in his dreams. He'd lost friends in those missions, their bodies left too far out to recover before the scavengers came. One night in '89 stood out, its code name long forgotten, but the scream of his radio when contact went dead still echoed in his ears, sharp and final. Frank blinked, trying to anchor himself, but the lobby was fading. The marble desk, the stack of laminated key cards, Ryan's faint smirk, they all blurred, swallowed by the heat rising in his chest and the ringing in his ears. His heart pounded, a familiar rhythm of panic that he'd fought for years to control. The past wasn't just a memory, it was a living thing, clawing its way into the present, dragging him back to places he had sworn he'd left behind. Then Shadow moved. The dog didn't bark or whine, didn't make a sound. He simply shifted. First a paw, then his whole body easing closer until his hip pressed firmly against Frank's leg. The touch was deliberate, a quiet but unyielding presence that cut through the chaos in Frank's mind. Shadow had been trained for this, to sense the signs before Frank even registered them himself. The shallow breaths, the racing pulse, the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes darted to exits and shadows, scanning for threats that weren't there. Shadow's weight against his knee was like a tether, a gentle but insistent pull that stopped Frank from tumbling over the edge. It wasn't a yank backward, just enough to keep him steady, to remind him he wasn't alone. Frank's hand, which had begun to tremble, stilled. He exhaled slowly through his nose, counting the way the VA counselor had taught him years ago. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 6. The buzzing of the lights receded, replaced by the soft tap of Ryan's fingers on the keyboard. Frank wasn't in Beirut. Not now, not anymore. He was here in this too clean lobby with Shadow by his side and a young man across the desk who couldn't understand what Frank carried. Frank looked at Ryan, really looked at him. He was young, maybe early 20s, with the kind of confidence that came from never having been tested by life. His arrogance wasn't cruelty, Frank realized, just ignorance. Maybe this was his first job, his first time dealing with someone like Frank. Maybe Frank, with his weathered face and quiet intensity, was nothing more than an inconvenience, a hurdle to get through before Ryan could clock out and go back to his uncomplicated world. But that didn't douse the fire in Frank's chest. It wasn't rage anymore, though. It was something heavier, a bone-deep weariness. He was tired of explaining, tired of justifying the things no one else could see. The nights he woke up gasping, the way crowds made his skin crawl, the years he'd slept with a knife under his pillow long after the wars had ended. He'd fought for a life of peace, for the freedom to walk through a world that didn't feel like a battlefield. But peace, he'd learned, was the hardest fight of all, a battle no one else could see or understand. Frank's hand moved slowly, reaching down to rest on Shadow's head. The dog's fur was soft under his calloused fingers, a quiet reminder that some things in this world were still good, still steady. He stroked Shadow gently, grounding himself in the moment, letting the weight of the past slip back into its place for now. Frank stood rooted in the dimly lit lobby, his broad shoulders squared, his stance unyielding yet calm, like a weathered oak weathering a storm. The weight of the moment pressed against his chest, but he refused to let it crack his composure. His hand rested gently on Shadow's smirks, the dog's warm, steady presence grounding him. Shadow's fur was soft under his calloused fingers, a quiet reminder of the bond that had carried him through sleepless nights and memories that clawed at his mind. "I'm still here," he murmured under his breath, the words a private mantra meant for no one but himself. In that fleeting moment, it was enough to keep the rising tide of frustration at bay. He faced Ryan, the young clerk behind the counter, whose eyes remained glued to the computer screen, indifferent to the gravity of the situation. Frank's voice, steady as ever, cut through the hum of the lobby. "I understand you might not be familiar with every regulation," he said, his tone measured, almost gentle, though it carried the weight of years spent navigating battles, both overseas and within himself. He slid the folder of documents a few inches closer to Ryan. I'm talking the papers neatly outlining Shadow's role as a service animal. The ADA is clear. Service dogs trained for medical assistance aren't subject to pet fees. These papers aren't just formality, they're legal protection, for me and for Shadow. Ryan didn't bother to glance at the folder. His fingers tapped idly on the keyboard. His posture slouched, exuding the kind of casual arrogance that comes from too many hours behind a desk, wielding small authority. "I already told you, sir," he said, his voice flat, almost bored. "The policy's clear. You want to stay here with the I, you pay the fee. No fee, no stay. That's it." The words were sharp, dismissive, like a door slammed shut. Frank's jaw tightened, but his face remained impassive. His fingers lingered on the folder's edge, the paper cool against his skin, a tangible reminder of the rights he'd fought to understand after years of navigating a world that didn't always see his scars. "I served in 3 theaters," he said, his voice low but resolute, each word deliberate. "This dog, Shadow, he's why I can walk into a room with a closed door and not feel like I'm back in a war zone, ready to fight ghosts that aren't there. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking you to respect federal law." Ryan leaned back in his chair, letting out a short, humorless laugh that grated against Frank's nerves. "Look, man," Ryan said, his tone dripping with skepticism, "I've seen plenty of people come through here with a bomb in a vest and some papers they printed off the internet. I'm not saying you're lying, but you don't look like you need a service dog." The words landed like a sucker punch, sharp and cutting, slicing through the fragile calm Frank had been holding on to. They weren't just an accusation. They were a dismissal of everything he'd endured, the invisible wounds that Shadow helped him carry. For a moment, the lobby seemed to hold its breath. The silence was heavy, like a threadbare blanket stretched too thin, barely holding the tension together. Frank didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, but inside a storm churned. Memories flickered, nights spent staring at the ceiling, heart pounding, Shadow's steady breathing pulling him back from the edge. He felt the familiar weight of being unseen, of having to prove his pain to someone who couldn't possibly understand. But Shadow shifted slightly, his body pressing gently against Frank's leg, a quiet anchor in the chaos. That small gesture steadied him, reminded him why he was standing here, refusing to back down. Without a word, Frank reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. His movements were slow, deliberate, as he pressed record. The tiny red light blinked to life, a silent witness to the moment. Ryan's eyes snapped up, his posture stiffening, suddenly alert. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharper now, edged with unease. "Documenting a potential ADA violation," Frank replied, his tone as calm as ever, though it carried an unmistakable steel. "I've tried to resolve this respectfully. You've made it clear that's not an option." Ryan's face flushed, his bravado faltering. "You can't record in here," he snapped, leaning forward now, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "This is private property. I'll call security, or the police if I have to." Frank's gaze didn't waver. "Call whoever you need to," he said evenly. "But threatening someone with law enforcement over a documented disability, that's a violation in itself." His words were quiet but carried the weight of truth, each one landing like a carefully aimed dart. He wasn't angry, not yet, but the conviction in his voice was unshakable, born from years of fighting battles far harder than this one. Across the lobby, movement caught Frank's eye. An older man, tall and silver-haired, rose from a reading chair near the fireplace. His long, gray wool coat hung elegantly on his frame, and though he was likely in his 70s, he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who'd once held sway in courtrooms or boardrooms. His face was unreadable, but his eyes were sharp, taking in the scene with a clarity that suggested he missed nothing. Without a word, he slipped a phone from his pocket and stepped toward the back of the lobby, his fingers already dialing. His voice, when it came, was too low to hear, but its calm, measured cadence carried an undeniable weight. Ryan's eyes flicked toward the man, then back to Frank, his confidence visibly fraying. The lobby wasn't empty. Others were watching now. A couple near the vending machine stood frozen, their hushed conversation forgotten as they observed the standoff. Toby, the young intern behind the counter, looked like a deer caught in headlights, his eyes darting between Ryan, Frank, Shadow, and the guests. The air felt charged, every small sound amplified. The soft hum of the vending machine, the faint ticking of the antique clock behind the desk. "You think recording me is going to change anything?" Ryan muttered, his voice quieter now, almost petulant. "We deal with this kind of thing all the time." Frank met his gaze, unflinching. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, just a quiet resolve that seemed to fill the space between them. "I'm not here to change your mind," he said, his voice steady as stone. "I'm here so the next veteran, the next person with the scars you can't see, doesn't have to stand here justifying their existence to someone who thinks they know better." The words weren't loud, but they carried a weight that seemed to settle over the room, silencing Ryan's protests. Somewhere in the back of the lobby, the older man's voice continued, low and deliberate, speaking into his phone. Frank didn't know who he was calling, a manager, a lawyer, maybe someone higher up the chain. But the quiet authority in the man's demeanor suggested that the call mattered. The lobby hung in a strange, suspended silence, the tension palpable, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock and the faint hum of the vending machine. Ryan shifted in his chair, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of the moment. Then, as if the universe itself had decided to intervene, the phone on the front desk rang. The sound was shrill, piercing, cutting through the quiet like a blade. Ryan jumped slightly, his eyes darting to Frank, then to the phone, then to the other guests still lingering nearby. His hand hovered over the receiver, hesitation flickering across his face. Frank stood still, Shadow seated calmly at his side, both of them unmoved, waiting. The air felt heavy with the promise of change, as if the next few moments would tip the balance of this quiet, unspoken battle. Ryan's hand hovered above the phone, trembling with a hesitation that betrayed his usual composure. When he finally grasped the receiver, he summoned a practiced customer service smile, though it felt like a fragile mask. "Red Elk Lodge, this is Ryan. How can I assist you today?" he said, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of unease. The smile faltered almost immediately, crumbling under the weight of the voice on the other end. Frank, standing nearby, couldn't hear the words being spoken, but he didn't need to. The transformation in Ryan's face told the story. His smug confidence evaporated, replaced by a flicker of panic that widened his eyes and tightened his jaw. His gaze flicked nervously to the computer screen, then to Frank, his throat bobbing in a slow, deliberate swallow that seemed to carry the weight of dread. Yes, he's still here," Ryan murmured, his voice dropping to a hushed, unsteady whisper, as if he feared the words might escape and haunt him. "Yes, I added the fee, but I didn't realize." He trailed off, the sentence dying in his throat. Another pause stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Frank stood motionless, his presence a quiet anchor in the room. Shadow, his service dog, mirrored his stillness, though the dog's ears twitched slightly, sensing the shift in the air. Even Toby, the intern, who had been half-heartedly shuffling brochures at the front desk, abandoned his pretense and stared openly, his curiosity piqued by the unspoken drama unfolding before him. Ryan's face flushed a deep crimson, the color creeping up his neck as he straightened in his chair, trying to reclaim some semblance of control. "I understand. Yes, of course," he whispered, his voice barely audible now, as if he were speaking to a judge delivering a verdict. His eyes drifted to the ADA pamphlet pinned behind the counter, its text faded and dog-eared, a document he'd likely never bothered to read. Now it loomed over him, its presence heavy with accusation, as if it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken laws. The voice on the phone grew sharper, more authoritative, cutting through Ryan's stammered excuses with surgical precision. He nodded instinctively, though no one could see it, his shoulders hunching as the reality of his mistake settled in. Frank didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His hand rested lightly on Shadow's back, the dog's steady warmth grounding him as he watched Ryan unravel. The wheels were turning now, not just in Ryan's mind, but in the larger machinery of consequence that had been set in motion. Ryan set the phone down with exaggerated care, as if it were made of glass and might shatter under the slightest pressure. When he looked at Frank, the brash, self-assured clerk from 15 minutes ago was gone, replaced by a young man who seemed to shrink under the weight of his own misstep. "That was corporate legal," Ryan said, his voice so soft it barely reached Frank's ears. Someone very connected called our regional office. They traced the incident in real time. Frank said nothing, his silence a deliberate choice. He simply waited, his expression unreadable, but his presence commanding. Ryan's eyes dropped to the counter, unable to hold Frank's gaze. They said I violated federal ADA law, he continued, his words faltering. They're opening a live investigation. They have already reviewed the service dog documentation and confirmed it's all valid. Another pause, heavier than the last, filled the room. Ryan's hands twitched, betraying his nerves. They're sending a district compliance officer tonight. I'm not supposed to touch anything else. The silence that followed was oppressive, thick with the weight of accountability. From the corner of the room, the judge who had been observing earlier reappeared, his phone now tucked away. He offered Frank a subtle, respectful nod before slipping quietly toward the exit, his role in this moment complete. Shadow shifted slightly, her calm presence a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the room moments before. For the first time that evening, Frank allowed himself a deep, steady breath, the kind that didn't feel like he was bracing for a fight. The battle, at least for tonight, seemed to be over. Ryan stood frozen behind the desk, his face pale, his hands trembling as they hovered over the keyboard. The smugness that had defined him earlier was gone, replaced by a quiet resignation. Corporate hadn't just ordered him to reverse the charge. They had issued precise, non-negotiable instructions. No excuses, no debate, just immediate action. His fingers moved haltingly across the keyboard as he pulled up Frank's guest profile, his eyes darting nervously between screens. Sir, I'm removing the sanitation fee now, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, laced with a humility he hadn't shown before. And I've been instructed to upgrade you to one of our signature suites. No charge. Frank watched in silence, his expression unchanging. Shadow sat calmly at his side, her steady presence a reminder of the bond that had been challenged but never broken. Ryan cleared his throat, reaching for a second keycard. He placed it on the counter with care, sliding it toward Frank without meeting his eyes. And I owe you an apology, he said, the words heavy with effort. The couple by the vending machine, who had been pretending to study the snack selection, froze, their attention now fully on the scene. Toby, leaning against the back wall, let his mouth fall open slightly, caught off guard by the shift in the room's atmosphere. Ryan struggled to find the right words, his voice catching. I made a mistake, he admitted, his tone raw with regret. I didn't understand the law. I shouldn't have. His voice trailed off, the weight of his error pressing down on him. He wasn't just apologizing to Frank. He was grappling with the realization that his actions had ripple effects far beyond this moment, reaching into the realm of legal consequences and personal accountability. The air in the hotel lobby hung heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Frank stood at the front desk, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the counter, knuckles pale but steady. Ryan, the young clerk behind the desk, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of his own words. I shouldn't have questioned your documentation, Ryan stammered, his voice betraying a faint tremor, like a crack in a dam holding back a flood. Or said what I did about your disability. I was wrong. His eyes darted to the floor, unable to meet Frank's steady gaze. Shame curled in Ryan's chest, a bitter knot that tightened with every passing second. He'd been so sure of himself, so quick to judge. But now the room seemed to close in around him, every pair of eyes in the lobby a silent accusation. Across the room, near the crackling fireplace, the old man who had made the call earlier settled back into his chair. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if he carried the weight of a lifetime's judgments. He didn't speak, but his actions spoke louder. A slow crossing of his legs, a single nod, sharp and final, like a gavel striking wood. His weathered face, etched with lines that told stories of decades past, remained impassive, but his eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. He'd heard enough, seen enough. The room held its breath, the silence stretching taut, a fragile thread waiting to snap. Then a sound pierced the stillness, a soft, deliberate clap. It came from the older woman by the vending machine, her hands meeting with purpose, no trace of mockery in the gesture. Her gray hair caught the dim light, and her eyes, sharp and knowing, held a quiet strength. She'd been watching, listening, her heart stirred by the injustice she'd witnessed. Her clap wasn't just applause. It was a declaration, a stand taken in the quiet of the moment. A few seconds later, her husband joined her, his hands slower, more hesitant, but no less sincere. His face, weathered like hers, softened with a flicker of pride as he followed her lead. The intern, barely out of his teens, hesitated, his hands hovering in midair. Doubt flickered in his mind. Should he join in? Was it his place? But something deeper, a gut instinct that felt right, pushed him forward. His clap was tentative at first, then firmer, a quiet echo of conviction. By the time Frank reached for the new keycard, the sound had grown. Half a dozen guests had joined in, their applause soft but steady, not a roar but a ripple, just enough to mark the moment. It wasn't loud, wasn't mocking, it was acknowledgement, pure and simple. Someone had noticed, someone had cared. Frank's hand closed around the keycard, his fingers brushing the smooth plastic, but his face remained unreadable. Inside, though, a storm churned. He'd faced worse than this. Battlefields, loss, the slow grind of a world that didn't always see him. But this moment, this small victory, stirred something he hadn't felt in years. The faint warmth of being seen, of being understood. Ryan's face burned, a flush creeping up his neck. His earlier confidence, so brash and unyielding, had evaporated, leaving behind a raw, humbling awareness. He'd nearly cost the hotel and himself dearly, all because he'd let his ignorance speak louder than his judgment. The weight of that mistake pressed against his ribs, a physical ache that made it hard to breathe. He wanted to say more, to apologize again, but the words stuck in his throat, heavy and useless. He stepped back, his hands fidgeting at his sides, as the front doors swung open with a gust of cold air. A woman in her early 50s strode in, her steps brisk and purposeful. She wore business slacks and a Lodge-branded coat, a badge dangling from a lanyard around her neck. Her presence commanded the room, not through volume, but through the quiet authority of someone who knew her place and her power. "Mr. Delaney," she called, her eyes scanning the lobby with practiced precision. "I'm Evelyn Price, regional manager. Legal just briefed me. May I speak with you privately?" Her tone was professional, but there was a warmth beneath it, a hint of understanding that softened the edges of her words. Frank gave a slow nod, his shoulders still squared, his posture betraying none of the weariness that gnawed at his bones. Shadow, his service dog, rose silently from his place at Frank's side, his movements fluid and alert. Ryan stepped aside as Evelyn gestured toward the lounge, her expression unreadable but her intent clear. As Frank walked past the desk, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The room had spoken, not just in words, but in the quiet power of collective acknowledgement. Something had shifted, not just in policy, but in the air itself, a subtle awakening, a ripple of awareness that spread beyond the walls of the lobby. The law had laid down its verdict, but so had the people in that room. The message was unmistakable. Dignity wasn't negotiable, and respect wasn't optional. Frank carried that truth with him, a quiet weight that settled alongside the scars he'd carried for years. The suite was more than Frank needed, far grander than he'd expected. A king-size bed dominated the room, its crisp linens almost too pristine. A leather armchair sat by a stone fireplace, where flames danced and flickered, casting warm shadows across the walls. It was more than he deserved, he thought for a fleeting moment, but he pushed the thought away. He stood just inside the doorway, his shoulders still tense, his eyes scanning the room out of habit. 2 windows, 1 fire escape, a heavy door with a deadbolt, a bathroom mirror angled toward the hallway. His mind mapped it all in seconds, a reflex born of years in places where survival demanded vigilance. Old habits didn't die. They just lay dormant, waiting for moments like this to stir them awake. Shadow moved first, stepping into the suite with the quiet grace of a creature who knew his purpose. His nose hovered close to the floor, tail steady as he made a slow circuit of the room, checking corners, sniffing the air. Satisfied, he returned to Frank's side and sat, his deep brown eyes locking onto his companion. Frank gave a faint nod, a silent exchange that needed no words. "Clear, huh?" he murmured, his voice low, almost lost in the crackle of the fire. He set his worn leather folder on the desk, its edges frayed from years of use, and peeled off his coat, draping it over the back of the armchair. He sank into the chair, the warmth of the fire seeping into his knees, easing the ache that had settled there years ago. The silence of the room wrapped around him, heavy but not oppressive, like a blanket he hadn't realized he'd missed. But peace was elusive, a fleeting guest that never stayed long. As Frank watched the flames dance, memories crept in, unbidden but familiar. Faces flickered in the firelight. Young faces, some too young. Men he'd known fought beside, buried. Williams, with his easy grin and Sinatra tunes, whistled on the flight deck in '83, his voice cutting through the roar of engines. Ramirez, whose laughter echoed even as the jungle closed in around them in Panama, his courage a light in the dark. Bellamy, always ready with a spare magazine and a terrible joke in Iraq, until the convoy hit that pressure plate and the world went silent. Frank hadn't seen them in years, but they lived in moments like this, in the quiet glow of firelight, in the shadows that clung to the edges of the night. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, and the weight of those memories pressed against his chest. Bellamy's voice came back, half serious, half laughing, as they sat in the dust of a foreign land. "You think they'll remember us back home?" Frank hadn't answered then, hadn't known how to. Even now the question lingered, unanswered, a quiet ache that never quite faded. His chest tightened, a familiar wave of grief washing over him, steady and unyielding. But then a soft sound broke through, a rustle against the bedspread. Shadow had climbed onto the floor beside the armchair, curling in tightly, his head resting near Frank's boots. Those deep brown eyes watched the fire, not alert, not tense, just present. Shadow didn't judge, didn't question. He was simply there, a quiet anchor in the storm of Frank's memories, a reminder that some things, loyalty, trust, dignity, endured even when the world forgot. Frank's hand glided gently along Shadow's sleek black fur, the dog's steady breathing a quiet anchor in the dim light of the Montana night. Each stroke was deliberate, grounding like a slow reel pulling him back from the edge of something jagged and raw. The world around him felt heavy, layered with memories he'd long packed away, like the medals he'd earned and tucked into a drawer, out of sight. The scars, some carved into his skin, others etched deep into his mind, remained hidden beneath the surface, carefully guarded. But Shadow didn't care about what was concealed. The dog didn't demand explanations or proof of pain. He simply stayed, his warm presence a silent promise of loyalty. For the first time in hours, Frank felt a knot inside him loosen, not with the lightness of joy or the release of relief, but with the quiet weight of rest. On this cold, bitter night, with the vast Montana sky stretching endlessly above, that small moment of peace was enough to carry him through. 3 weeks later, back at his secluded home in rural Oregon, where the world felt slower and softer, a package arrived on Frank's weathered porch. There was no return address, no glossy promotional stickers, just his name, Frank Delaney, printed neatly on a plain white shipping label. The simplicity of it caught him off guard, stirring a flicker of curiosity in his chest. He carried the box inside, setting it on the kitchen table where Shadow lounged nearby, watching with calm, attentive eyes. Inside, wrapped in unassuming brown paper, was an American flag, its folds precise and deliberate, as if it carried the weight of something sacred. It had once flown over the regional headquarters of Red Elk Hospitality Group, a detail that stirred a faint memory of that night in Missoula. Beneath the flag lay a polished wooden plaque, its surface gleaming under the soft light. The inscription read, "In recognition of your service, sacrifice, and the quiet dignity with which you reminded us what respect truly means." Frank's throat tightened as he traced the words with his fingertip, the sentiment sinking into him like a stone settling in still water. It wasn't the recognition that moved him. It was the acknowledgement that his quiet stand had left a mark. Tucked beneath the plaque was a letter written on thick, embossed stationery that felt substantial in his hands. The words were formal, but carried a warmth that felt genuine, not rehearsed. "Mr. Delaney," it began, "we are deeply sorry for the experience you encountered at our Missoula property. You should never have been placed in a position to defend your right to dignity and access. We've initiated mandatory ADA training across all our properties and updated internal policies to ensure this never happens again. Thank you for your patience and for reminding us that honoring service begins with listening. With respect, Evelyn Price, Regional Manager, Red Elk Lodge. Frank read the letter slowly, then again, lingering on the phrase reminding us. It echoed in his mind, stirring a mix of emotions, validation, weariness, and a quiet sense of vindication. He didn't need the flag or the plaque. He hadn't expected anything beyond the silence he'd grown accustomed to. But there was something about the gesture that felt right. Not grand or ostentatious, but sincere, like a handshake offered after a long misunderstanding. He set the box aside, his hand finding Shadow's head for a gentle pat, the dog's steady presence pulling him back to the moment. Months passed, and the Oregon winter gave way to the tentative warmth of spring. The snow melted, revealing patches of green that crept across the valley like a slow promise of renewal. One morning in early May, as the first wildflowers began to dot the landscape, a second letter arrived. This one was different, handwritten, with no letterhead, the penmanship slightly uneven, as if written with care but not perfection. Inside was a single folded page, its words carrying a raw honesty that caught Frank off guard. "Mr. Delaney," it read, "this may not mean much coming from me, but I wanted to thank you. I've spent the last few months in training programs about disability rights, PTSD, and veteran care. I used to think I understood enough just by being polite. I was wrong. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't humiliate me, but you held your ground. That taught me more than any textbook ever could. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just hoping to become someone who never makes another veteran feel small again. Respectfully, Ryan Mitchell." Frank held the letter for a long time, his eyes tracing the uneven loops of the handwriting. Each word felt like a small confession, a crack in the armor of someone who had been forced to confront their own ignorance. He could picture Ryan, young perhaps, well-meaning but unaware, standing behind that hotel counter in Missoula, unaware of the weight of his words. Frank's chest tightened, not with anger, but with something softer, something like understanding. He folded the letter carefully, tucking it into the back of his worn leather folder, the one that held Shadow's service dog documents and his VA paperwork. He didn't file it away because he needed proof of what had happened. He kept it because it mattered, because some lessons, hard-won and quietly learned, deserve to be remembered. Frank didn't talk much about that night in Montana, not because he wanted to erase it from his memory, but because he knew it wasn't an isolated moment. Variations of that encounter, misunderstandings, assumptions, quiet dismissals, played out every day in hotel lobbies, airport terminals, and checkout lines across the country. What happened to him wasn't just a failure of customer service. It was a reflection of something deeper, something woven into the fabric of a society still learning to see what isn't obvious. Frank carried an invisible disability, one that didn't announce itself with a wheelchair or bandages. To the world, he looked fine, upright, composed, his voice steady and his demeanor calm. But trauma doesn't always leave visible marks, and healing doesn't always look like a limp or a scar. People expect disability to fit a neat mold, something they can recognize at a glance. When it doesn't, they assume it's not there. Frank had felt that assumption in the way the hotel staff had questioned Shadow's presence, in the way their eyes had searched him for proof he didn't owe them. But Shadow had stayed by his side, unwavering, and in that moment Frank had found the strength to stand his ground, not with anger, but with the quiet dignity that came from knowing his own truth. The notion that it could be anything less than real feels like a cruel illusion. Yet for millions of Americans, particularly those who've served in uniform, the daily struggle is a silent war waged deep within, invisible to the world around them. Anxiety grips like a vice, squeezing breath from their lungs. Flashbacks drag them back to moments they'd rather forget, replaying scenes of chaos with unrelenting clarity. Hypervigilance keeps them on edge, scanning every room for threats that may never come. Panic surges without warning, a storm breaking inside their chest. Depression lingers like a heavy fog, dulling the colors of life. For many of these veterans, a trained service animal isn't just a companion or a convenience. It's a lifeline, a steady anchor in a sea of turmoil. Shadow, a service dog with soulful eyes and a quiet strength, is no mere pet. He's the difference between a veteran teetering on the edge of despair and one who can find a moment of calm, a fleeting sense of safety. But not everyone sees it that way. Every time someone casts a skeptical glance at Shadow's vest, adorned with patches that declare his purpose, or demands to see paperwork as if it's their right to question, it's more than just ignorance. It's a subtle but piercing message. Your pain isn't valid unless you can prove it. For someone like Frank, a veteran who's carried the weight of his experiences for years, those moments sting with a quiet betrayal. He's fought for his country, faced horrors most can't imagine, and now he must justify his need for the one thing that helps him navigate the world. The doubt in their eyes feels like a judgment, not just of Shadow, but of Frank's very existence, as if his struggles are somehow less real because they are not etched into his skin for all to see. That night at the Red Elk Lodge, though, something different unfolded. It wasn't just another confrontation, another moment of misunderstanding. It was a flicker of hope, a reminder that change is possible even in the face of ignorance. Ryan, a young man barely out of his teens, had spoken carelessly, his words laced with the kind of casual dismissal that cuts deeper than he could have known. Maybe he thought he was being clever, or maybe he just didn't think at all. But when Frank responded, not with anger, but with a quiet, steady explanation of what Shadow meant to him, something shifted. Ryan's face changed. The smirk faded, replaced by a dawning realization. He listened, really listened, as Frank described the invisible battles he fought every day, battles that Shadow helped him endure. In that moment, Ryan wasn't just hearing words, he was seeing a man's truth laid bare, and he didn't turn away. For Frank, that night wasn't about proving a point or winning an argument. It was about standing in his truth with a dignity forged through years of resilience. He could have lashed out, could have let the frustration of being questioned yet again boil over. But instead, he chose patience. He chose to educate, to bridge the gap between his reality and Ryan's ignorance. And Ryan, to his credit, didn't double down or walk away. He stayed, absorbed the lesson, and left that encounter a little wiser, a little more human. That's no small thing. In a world quick to cancel and condemn, Ryan's willingness to learn showed that growth doesn't always require punishment. Sometimes it starts with a single conversation, a moment of connection that plants a seed for change. For those who've lived through decades of shifting perspectives, older generations who've watched society slowly, sometimes grudgingly, come to terms with the realities of veterans and disabilities, Frank's story might hit close to home. The quiet disrespect, the skeptical glances, the assumption that if you don't look disabled, your struggle isn't real. It's all too familiar. Maybe you felt that sting yourself, or maybe you've watched a loved one shrink under the weight of someone's careless words. Frank's stand at the Red Elk Lodge wasn't just for him. It was for every veteran who's ever had to explain their pain, for every person who's been told their disability isn't visible enough to matter. He carried himself with a quiet strength, not because it was easy, but because he knew the truth of his experience was undeniable, even if others couldn't see it. That night was more than a fleeting moment. It was a testament to the power of stories like Frank's, stories that don't just tug at the heart, but demand reflection. They force us to confront what respect really means, to question the assumptions we carry, and to listen when someone tells us their truth. For every veteran who's walked out of a room feeling diminished, for every person who's had to justify their existence to a world that doesn't always understand, Frank's story is a reminder. You're not alone. Your pain is real, your strength is real, and your story matters. We hope this resonates with you. If it does, take a moment to share your thoughts, your experience, or even just a word of understanding. Stories like this don't just inspire, they spark conversations that can shift perspectives and build empathy. They remind us to see the person behind the vest, the truth behind the struggle. And if this story moved you, consider liking, subscribing, or joining us as we continue to share the quiet, powerful stories of those who've given so much and ask for so little in return. Together, together, we can make these stories more than moments. They can be the start of something greater.